Vladimir Putin's last attempt to improve relations with Donald Trump seems to have failed. Vladimir Putin sent his envoy Kirill Dmitriev to Washington to save relations with Trump, who had already imposed sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil and prepared a new package of restrictions. And today he also publicly stated that he would only meet with Putin if Putin publicly shows that he is truly ready to make a peace agreement with Ukraine. Putin's envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, who rushed to Washington after the sanctions were announced and is now giving interviews while awaiting a meeting with Steve Witkoff, said Russia is lowering its demands and may be ready to sign a peace deal with Ukraine. Dmitriev is doing everything he can to show the American public that Russia fully supports Donald Trump's plan for Ukraine. Supposedly, Kyiv is the one not agreeing to an immediate one. Dmitriev said the Kremlin is ready for an immediate ceasefire, but only if it ensures lasting peace. But at the same time, Dmitriev stated that it was supposedly Ukraine that started the war, not Russia, and that now all Russian speakers in Ukraine need to be protected territorially, whatever that means. But Dmitriev also began to publicly play on Donald Trump's ego, claiming that the United States president is supposedly repeating Joe Biden's tactics, which allegedly turned out to be a failure. But in all these speeches by Putin's envoy, there is another important point to be seen. The Kremlin is very dissatisfied that Trump pushed Steve Witkoff aside from negotiations with the Russians and replaced him with a smarter, more professional Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who in just a couple of days convinced Trump to cancel the meeting with Putin in Budapest and to impose sanctions against Russia. My name is Alexei Piche. Today is October 26th. Let's discuss this topic together. It's very rich. But before we start this episode, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this episode. Subscribe to my Telegram channel, Piche News, using the link in this video's description. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so by donating through the links and details in the description of this video. It says there, support the Alexei Piche channel. Choose any format that's convenient for you, whether it's a donation, sponsorship, or a paid subscription. I appreciate any support. Today, Donald Trump essentially sent Vladimir Putin packing. The President of the United States said that he will not meet with Putin until he sees that Putin is truly ready to make a peace agreement with Ukraine. The American leader emphasized that he is no longer going to waste his time. I have to be sure that we will make a deal, said Trump. The head of the White House added that he has always had an excellent relationship with the President of Russia, but he was very disappointed by the latter's unwillingness to end the war against Ukraine. And this phrase has become the pinnacle of the change in Donald Trump's rhetoric today. After all, before this, Trump not only cancelled his meeting with Putin in Budapest, but also did so for the first time during his second presidential term. He imposed sanctions against Russian oil giants, and is working to ensure that India and China significantly reduce their purchases of Russian oil. Let me pause here for a moment and go into a bit more detail, because this is very important. On the eve, sources in the White House stated that United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio had a strong influence on Trump's position. Let me briefly recap the events. From the very beginning, Donald Trump appointed two special envoys who were supposed to resolve two conflicts, between Israel and Hamas in the Middle East and between Ukraine and Russia. These two special envoys, as you know, are Steve Witkoff and General Keith Kellogg. So, General Kellogg, even before the 2024 presidential election, laid out his vision for ending Russia's war against Ukraine. This vision sounded very simple. If Ukraine does not agree to peace, but the Kremlin does, then all aid to Ukraine is cut off, and Kyiv is essentially forced into negotiations. If Ukraine is ready for peace, but Russia is against it or is stalling, Ukraine receives more military aid and Russia faces sanctions primarily against its oil sector in order to strangle the oil industry and thus deprive the Russian budget of revenue. But later, as you remember, Russia stated that Kellogg was too pro-Ukrainian and Marco Rubio was not suitable at all as a negotiator. And then Donald Trump accommodated the Russians, and what did he do? He removed Keith Kellogg and Marco Rubio from the Ukraine issue. He gave these powers to Steve Witkoff, who then went to Putin in Russia. After the Alaska summit, Donald Trump publicly expressed disappointment in Steve Witkoff, who was coordinating negotiations with the Russians. Afterward, Trump returned to Keith Kellogg and Marco Rubio. For example, Trump had Rubio, not Witkoff, prepare the meeting with Putin in Budapest. And it took Rubio just one phone call with Lavrov to realize that there was no point in the meeting. Rubio conveyed this information to Trump. Trump cancels his meeting with Putin in Budapest and imposes sanctions. He also threatens, by the way, with a new package and goes to meet with Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader. So the Kremlin lost its influence over Trump through Steve Witkoff. Besides Putin, which Russians did Witkoff communicate with the most? It's also important to remember, especially with Kirill Dmitriev. And so Dmitriev ends up in Washington after the announcement of United States sanctions against Russia. Now let's return to the current situation and go through it step by step to avoid confusion. After Donald Trump's abrupt turnaround this week, when he imposed sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil and also cancelled the summit with Putin in Budapest, the Kremlin urgently sends a key negotiator on Ukraine to the United States. Kirill Dmitriev, head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, who has been connecting with Donald Trump since his first term, is flying to Washington on Friday. And it's funny that for the third day in a row, he's being ignored in Washington because he's running around handing out internet. Dmitriev himself said that a meeting with some high-ranking official had been scheduled a long time ago, and it hasn't been cancelled in Washington. That's why I flew in, and now I'm just waiting to be called. Steve Witkoff already knows everything. And it's funny that after Donald Trump announced the cancellation of the summit with Putin, Dmitriev insisted that preparations for the meeting were still ongoing. He also put forward the idea of building a tunnel under the Bering Strait that would connect Chukotka and Alaska. Dmitriev insisted that the tunnel would supposedly become a symbol of unity between Russia and the United States. And so while in Washington, Dmitriev gives an interview to Fox News, which is also watched by Donald Trump. And after this interview, some media outlets, Ukrainian language and Russian language media outlets mistakenly claimed that Dmitriev started to give in. Trump just had to impose sanctions. They said that Putin's envoy stated they were ready to make concessions on Ukraine. But no, in reality, Russia didn't give up a single inch of what it had been demanding before. Let's examine the main statement from Putin's envoy in Washington. So, the Kremlin knows perfectly well that Trump is still hesitating, and Steve Witkoff has always helped sway Trump to the Russian side. But, as we already know, Witkoff has been pushed aside from this issue a bit, and the Russians started to panic. And who among the Russians is closest to Witkoff? And who can offer the kind of business deals that Donald Trump likes? That's right, it's Kirill Dmitriev. That's why the task of Putin's envoy is very simple, to try to convince Donald Trump. The quickest route to peace is through Witkoff, not Marco Rubio. And you do remember that now it's Marco Rubio who's in charge, right? Ideally, the Russian Dmitriev would like to pit both Witkoff and Rubio against each other. Dmitriev is simply trying to show that Rubio is making everything more complicated. Well, it's much easier to force Ukraine to surrender, as Witkoff says, and then this story will be over. Well, now I'll give you a few quotes from that very Dmitriev on Fox News. Dmitriev deliberately simplifies the Russian position, understanding that, in the Trump administration, probably no one except Marco Rubio can really figure out what is actually meant by the root causes of the conflict. As Russians always say, and here are the so-called concessions from Russia. Dmitriev states that there are only 3 points for a peaceful settlement, just 3, and they all resonate with Donald Trump's points. The first is security guarantees for Ukraine. Dmitriev assures that Russia is open to such security guarantees, but Dmitriev does not specify what these guarantees actually are. And this is essentially Istanbul 2022, where Russia has the right to veto any foreign aid to Ukraine. That is, Russia attacks and Russia blocks military aid. This is already a well-known fact for Ukrainians and for Marco Rubio. It seems, and he also seems to understand the absurdity of such a proposal. But Witkoff says that in principle it's not a bad idea, and Witkoff said, listen, Putin agrees, we're hesitating on security guarantees. So let's make a deal. Second, Dmitriev states that the territorial issue needs to be resolved where the Russian population lives, which, quote, was attacked by Ukrainian forces even before the conflict. Well, first of all, what the hell is this so-called Russian population in Ukraine that the Ukrainian army supposedly attacked? But isn't Russia now wiping off the face of the earth exactly those cities where objectively more Russian-speaking people lived? Isn't that so? Secondly, this message about, quote, Ukrainian troops attacked even before the conflict is aimed at those who are completely out of context. Before what start of the conflict? Which one? Russia started the war against Ukraine in 2014. Not in 2022, as many think. Now, back to protecting the Russian-speaking population. I won't go on and on. I'll just show you a fragment of Russian propaganda from the same day when this Dmitriev was voicing all this nonsense on an American television channel.
Proofreader A. Kulakova. There will be no life in Kharkov, nor in Poltava, nor in Nikolaev, nor in Odessa. These cities will not exist, and neither will Kiev. If the civilians do not realize that they have been chosen as expendable material and do not overthrow their Nazi government, and if you have no strength, at least leave those cities. Understand that you are being used as a human shield. If you have no strength to leave. Sorry, let me remind you of the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. There were surely residents there as well.
So, Russia is currently committing genocide, primarily against Russian-speaking Ukrainians, simply because it is advancing in a region where, before the war, there were more Russian speakers than Ukrainian speakers. But does Vitkov understand this? I don't think so, since Vitkov said during Zelensky's last Washington visit that there's a Russian-speaking population there. What does that mean? By his logic, these regions should go to Russia due to their Russian-speaking population. Thirdly, as Dmitriev notes, this concerns Ukraine's uncertain neutrality. Dmitriev doesn't say that neutrality means a ban on Western aid to Ukraine and the de facto disarmament of Ukraine. Written in Istanbul 2022, Dmitriev is also trying to cozy up to Trump and play on his feelings. Here are a few exact quotes. Biden already imposed sanctions, but they failed. The answer is dialogue, not sanctions. Putin defends Russia's national interests, just like Trump defends national interests. Biden's approaches don't work. Biden wanted to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. So, Dmitriev is kind of trying to humiliate Donald Trump by saying that he has stooped so low that he resorted to Joe Biden's methods. But he also says that supposedly Russians are just defending their national interests, just like Americans do. Well, of course, that's a lie. Well, at least because Trump doesn't wage wars of conquest to destroy entire nations. Well, and the funniest phrase from Dmitriev is this one. We don't believe that sanctions will have a significant impact on the Russian economy, because oil prices will rise and Russia will simply sell less gasoline at a higher price. So, Dmitriev, are there sanctions or not? If it doesn't matter, why did you come to Washington? What happened? Dmitriev appeared on both Fox News and Cable News Network, but was asked very different questions on Cable News Network. To put it very briefly, Dmitriev tried to dodge as much as he could, but it didn't work out. The host Melania asked Trump, "How do you strike maternity hospitals?" Dmitriev replied, "I'm not a military man, but the military say that we only strike military targets. Have you noticed how many more civilian casualties there are elsewhere in the world? Ukraine was the first to attack Russian speakers. There's a lot of disinformation." The host says, "Sir, with respect, I went to Ukraine and saw it myself." "This week, you bombed a kindergarten in Kharkiv," Dmitriev responds. "Of course, we did not bomb a kindergarten. Sometimes Ukrainian air defense hits these targets. But I'm not a military man." In general, that's the unwashed Russian in a nutshell. And just listen closely to the words of Dmitriev. Russians supposedly don't strike civilian targets, but if there are civilian casualties somewhere else in the world, then why, shouldn't Russians be allowed to? And actually, it was Ukraine that attacked first, if you didn't know. By the way, this claim that Ukraine attacked first is already showing some Nazi tendencies. And what did the Hitlerites shout at the beginning of World War II? We didn't attack Poland, it was supposedly the Poles who attacked Gleiwitz. Isn't that what the Hitlerites, the Nazis, shouted? And here Dmitriev says, it wasn't us who attacked, it was Ukraine who attacked. Attacked whom? Donbass. Well, as for the words that Russia didn't bomb the kindergarten in Kharkiv, Dmitriev, and that it was all Ukrainian air defense, I really hope that Dmitriev will burn in hell. In Kharkiv, at the kindergarten. There was a direct hit by at least 2 drones in a row. This wasn't a random hit by debris. It was a direct hit by 2 drones. And the cherry on top. Dmitriev stated directly that First Lady Melania, to put it bluntly, is simply lying to Trump about Russian strikes on civilians. How do you like that, Donald Trump? I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.